I'm the Communities Manager at Voluntary Norfolk, and I'm very grateful to my colleague Laura Holland, who is providing technical support today for the session. I am being joined today, I'm very pleased and honoured to say, by Dr. Jurgen Grotz, the Senior Research Fellow and the Director of the Institute for Volunteering Research at the University of East Anglia. And we're sponsored by CBR Business Solutions, who are sponsoring the whole of the Empowering Communities Partnership annual conference. If you have any questions during my presentation, please put them in the chat and I'll try and answer them later on. Okay, so we are now up to 15. So the format of this session is that I'm going to introduce the strategy development process and the emerging themes as we are today in sort of mid-process. At the end of my presentation, which is quite a lot of slides, I have to warn you, because there's an awful lot of information I wanted to share with you at this point, then we'll take a short comfort break just for 5 minutes. And then Jurgen will share his reflections on the volunteering landscape and examples of adaptations and innovations that he's aware of. And he's not going to bombard you with lots more slides. So you will just have Jurgen, who's a very good speaker, to sharing his knowledge and experience. We're then going to go into some breakout rooms to consider a couple of questions, come back for a short plenary, and at that point there's a chance for questions and discussion. We will finish at 3 o'clock. So, a volunteering strategy for Norfolk. So why is one needed? As we are all aware, the volunteering landscape and the voluntary community and social enterprise sector has changed quite a lot in the last 2.5 years. Organizations have emerged, adapted, or gone under. And the age, the availability, and the interest profile of volunteers has been changing. And we are aware that the diversity and inclusion are ever more important. And new forms of volunteering have emerged too, including impromptu, informal, and localized groups, as well as statutory sector schemes. So VCSE organizations need to understand these new expectations and requirements. And the Empowering Communities Partnership, of which Voluntary Norfolk is a member, needs to provide leadership and effective support to the sector based on the evidence of need in this changing world. So what we're doing, we are gathering intelligence to help shape the strategy, and that's the process that we're in the midst of at the moment. We're very much in a work in progress because the online surveys have only just closed, and we're still very much analysing the information we've gathered from that, and we are still going through that process. We are and will continue to talk to individuals and to organisations of all sizes and types to help build up this picture of what the sector's experiences of working with volunteers and volunteers' experience of the sector is at this moment. The way that we're doing it is start by gathering information, attitudes and experiences of individuals and organisations through online surveys, which have been widely distributed through networks and stakeholders. This information will be enhanced by a number of targeted consultation workshops and discussions with individuals and those involved in leading VCSE organisations, including today's session. And the next stage is to analyse the results, look at them within a national and a regional context, and interrogate the data in different ways to try and pick out trends and areas for development and positive actions going forward. We'll feed the results and the emerging themes and proposals back to the sector for response and prioritisation, and then we'll develop a 3-year strategy setting out the underpinning values and the principles, the key issues and challenges, guidelines for good practice, and measurable objectives for development. This will be disseminated widely with action plan templates for sector organizations to individualize and to set their own goals and targets. So the survey for individuals has closed, and as I say, we're starting on that analysis. The online survey for organizations is still open for a few more weeks. So if you have tuned in today and you've not yet answered it, please do so before the end of the month. We then plan to have the draft document to share with the sector in February so that it can be finalized and shared with stakeholders in March next year. So these are some of the results from the online survey for individuals. This is clearly not a representative sample of the population, but a self-selecting group of people who chose to answer this particular survey. So we cannot extrapolate hard and fast information from the data, but we can use it as an indicator of local people's attitudes to and experiences of volunteering, and a useful prompt about emerging issues and trends in behavior and attitude. So 251 people completed the survey, 76% female, 22% male, and 2% either didn't answer or were there as non-binary. 95.5% identified as British in some way, English, Welsh, Scottish, Northern British, Northern Irish, 2.5% as any other white background, and 2% as white, Asian, or Indian, or African, or other ethnic group. The age range, as I'll show you the next slide, was broad from 15 to over 75. So I hope you can see this clearly. So this is the breakdown of age. The number at the top there, 237, are the number of people who answered this specific question. It varies throughout the presentation, as not all questions were relevant to everyone, and some people chose not to answer some questions. So almost 40% were under 50. Another 40% were between 50 and 64 years old. That's the this sandy colored section. And just 22% were the blue and dark green sections, which were 65 and over. So the profile of respondents was somewhat younger than we might have expected, and shows a pretty good spread across different age groups. When asked about limiting long-term illness, disability, or difference, as you can see, 76.5% had none, but 23.5% registered that they did have one. And when asked about employment status, the blue section are those in employment and self-employment, which is about 62%, which fits with the earlier age profile, really, and just 25.7% were retired. So again, perhaps if we'd asked this question a few years ago, we might have had a smaller number of employed and a higher number of retirees, but that's just my speculation. We asked across Norfolk, and we were very pleased that we got a good response from across the county. Slightly more in Norwich, the 23.4%, the green section were from Norwich, but South Norfolk, Broadland, and North Norfolk also were good level of responses. So we can say that I think that there is a spread of opinion from across the county, the rural as well as the more urban areas. When asked, do you currently or have you ever volunteered? So 92% people said yes, they had. Just 8% hadn't, but that still represents 20 people. So it was actually brave and helpful that those 20 were prepared to go through and answer some of the questions that were relevant to them, to give us an idea about attitudes of those people too. And when asked if they're currently volunteering, 76%, the blue, said yes they were, and 24% were not currently. that they had done in the past or recent past. And when asked about the nature and frequency of their volunteering, the blue section is regular, formal, that is once a week or once a month or on a regular basis, whereas the sandy 36.3% is more informal volunteering, with people do it as and when they can or when they're needed to, or perhaps they're taking part in a local community organization that meets and gets together as and when there's a need to do things. Just 1.2% were other. So of those that do currently volunteer, again, the large proportion, almost 2/3, did volunteer for a registered charity. The yellow is limited company, and it might be that some of the organizations were both a limited company and a registered charity. The paler blue are voluntary groups, more informal groups and community groups. So with over 3,300 registered charities in Norfolk, it's not too surprising that 63% of respondents did volunteer for the registered charities. But we still do have 58 responses from people who are volunteering in other ways. So the question next was, what are your motivations for volunteering? And over 3/4, 78% of respondents said that their motivation was to improve things or to help people, which I think tends to be the dominant response when people are asked. But it's interesting that over half of respondents also cited enjoyment, feeling a sense of purpose, and the importance to them of the organization or the cause. This greeny one here and the sea green one up here were for those. So there is also the experience, obviously, of the volunteer is as important as, in a way, as the fact that they are helping others. They need to feel that they are doing something that is really worthwhile. Our next question was, what are the main benefits to you of volunteering? And so it's not surprising that making a difference, it was the top response, with over 85% of people responding in that way. But given the opportunity to select a number of options, it is significant that 57% selected making the most of my skills, which is the orangey box, which reflects that people's time is precious and they want the opportunity to use their knowledge and experience to make the biggest impact. Feeling connected to others is the turquoisey blue block, which presumably means fellow volunteers, staff and service users. And this was obviously very important too, followed by learning new things and increasing my skills, which is the dark reddy maroony box, and slightly less important, but still representing a significant number of people, were the options to take feeling happier, being active, increasing self-confidence, and seeing or making new friends. So that again backs up the fact that the experience of the individual volunteer is very important, and that they want to use their skills to learn new skills and to share these in a meaningful way. Now the next slide, I'm going to ask you to respond to. So we next ask how their experience could be improved. And we are going to use a poll now to ask you what you think the answers will be from the volunteers. And then your anonymous responses will be shown on the poll, and we will compare it then with how the volunteers themselves responded to the same question. So, Laura, how do we do this bit?
I'm going to launch the polls in just a second.
Okay, Frustratingly, I can't see. I can't see.
Okay, well, we've got, I'm not quite sure why you can't see it, Nikki.
We've lost it from the screen now, Amelia, so we can't
Oh,
see it on the
okay.
screen.
It's still, there's about, people are still voting. So I'm just going to leave it for a minute. I think 71 people have voted. So I'm going to end the poll now and share the results.
Lovely.
Can
Yeah,
you
we
see
can
that?
see
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Can you see that, Nikki?
No, I can't. So you'll just need to have to
Okay.
tell me
So,
what the responses are.
okay, so I'll just take you through. So how could your volunteering experience be improved? So 70% of people said more flexible roles. 50% said more training and support. 40% said a clearer sense of what is expected of me. 30% said better supervision and leadership. 30% said greater understanding of my personal situation. And 10% said easy access information about volunteering opportunities. So is that okay? Would you like me to stop sharing now, Nikki?
Yes, please. That's great. Thank you. Great. Well, that's very interesting. Thank you. And I'll now show you what how the respondents voted. So, in fact, for them, the top response was this one here: more training and support, which you put at as the second most likely response. And the next one after that was easy to access information about volunteering opportunities, which you put down as priority 5. So it's interesting that from the poll we've just done, you selected more flexible roles as being the most significant. And this was actually flexible roles is the third one down here, which is this one at the top. So we're not madly out, actually. So more training and support and more flexible roles were important to them, but also the easy to access information, which is about, for us, the Get Involved platform. Means we need to be promoting that. A lot more people are not finding access to that. Their next key one was actually more sociable and fun elements. The grey box was the fourth most significant option, followed by the clear sense of what's expected, the better supervision, and the greater understanding of my personal situation. So I don't think we were madly out, which is great. But I was actually struck when I saw the results that the more training and support was the thing that came through most strongly from the respondents, which I think is something. So that's 122 people. That is something we sometimes feel it's quite difficult to sell the idea of training, but perhaps it's more a sense of overall support that people are feeling that they're in need of. And clearly flexible roles is important too, and that again is something that we as a sector need to address, of how we can make roles more flexible and adaptable to people's work and living habits. So the next questions we asked was why those who were no longer volunteering, why they had stopped volunteering. And perhaps not surprisingly, 54.5% said it was to do with work commitments, and 31% to do with caring and family commitments. So that is obviously, what most people are having to spend their time doing, not surprisingly. But also the health and mental well-being issues were nearly 20%. And a very small number actually responded because it was something to do with the pandemic. Nobody said that they were limiting contact because of the pandemic, and just 5% said they had increased anxiety due to the pandemic. So so that's interesting that it appears that people have moved on from that at the moment. It's not something that is holding them back, but it's more the demands of their everyday life, their family, their work commitments that are getting in the way of that. And they're also finding it difficult perhaps to know where to find the information. So for non-volunteers, we asked them what stopped them from volunteering. And again, not surprisingly, it's the work commitments and the family commitments that were the main barriers to them feeling that they could volunteer. The next largest one was that I do other things with my spare time. So that's presumably hobbies and other leisure activities that are taking precedence. And maybe particularly in the light of everybody being restricted in what they could do over the last few years, this has become more of a priority for people. A significant number, over 14%, said they haven't heard about opportunities, and nearly 10% said they don't know any groups that need my help. So that is 25% of people, of options anyway, that people were feeling that they hadn't got access to the right information. 14% said I'd never thought about it. So perhaps that's something that tells us we need to get the message out there more loudly, that there are lots of interesting opportunities and people are really needed. Personal financial reasons was a significant, nearly 20% of people, so that stopped them. But it was also interesting that the ones that got zero response were, I'm not the right age, I have an illness or disability that prevents me from getting involved, it's not my responsibility, opportunities are not accessible to me or inclusive, and I am limiting contact with others. So those were not priorities for any of our respondents, given that they could tick as many boxes as they wanted to. So I do think that is also quite significant. I was going to do another poll now, but actually I'm going to leave that, given that they are slightly tricky to do. But the next question that we asked was similar to the last one, is what would enable you to volunteer if given that you can't at the moment, or you're choosing not to at the moment. And by far the largest was this turquoise box here, which is the access to information about volunteering opportunities. So that is what seems to be stopping many people from getting involved. They don't know what's out there. The next requirement was more flexible roles. So that again is coming through very strongly as a message for the sector. The next one there is the clearer, the green box is a clear sense of what's expected of me. So setting out descriptions and making sure that people are new volunteers are inducted effectively and given a right training and support is clearly very important. And then the next ones, which was more training and support, more sociable and fun elements, and other, which was a range of options of some particular situations, were the ones that were highest in terms of what would enable them or encourage them to volunteer in the future. The greater understanding of my personal situation was quite low, and better supervision and leadership was low, but then these are people who are not taking part at the moment, so that's probably not something that comes across very strongly. Moving to these are encouraged. We asked all current and former volunteers, would you recommend volunteering? 173 people and 99.4% said yes, they would. Just 0.6% saying no. So that's, I think, a really encouraging response. Of the lapsed volunteers, we asked them, would you volunteer in the future? And again, 94% said yes, they would. And when non-volunteers were asked if they'd volunteer in the future, 95.2% said that they would. So I think that we're seeing that it's not necessarily that the people aren't out there, but for some reason our offer or our communication or their perceptions of what we're doing isn't encouraging them to join again. We've had loads and loads of different comments from the people who filled in the survey to the question about their volunteering experience. We had 128 responses, and these are general comments that we asked people that they could contribute. So I just thought I just picked out a few, and I thought I'd just read these because they're quite interesting. So the top one is that I volunteered for a variety of different organizations, and decent training, supervision, and understanding are so vital to make this enjoyable. If it isn't enjoyable, you won't keep turning up, or you'll do the bare minimum. And if your role involves dealing with other members of the public, a desultory volunteer is really off-putting. So focus again on training, supervision, and understanding the role. The next person said, if there are any roles that could be done in the evening, online or from home, I would have more capacity to support these. So that takes us back to the flexible roles comments. Someone else said, volunteer is best when well managed and supported. So volunteers know where they stand and benefits. And this last one I found quite interesting because we obviously think a lot of the time about being more professional in the way that we communicate. This time they were slightly off-putting. So it said, I think the main thing that puts me off volunteering is that a lot of the adverts for volunteering require you to have a lot of experience in a role. The volunteer description sounds more like a job than a volunteering role. This was talking about the specific situation. It was clear there weren't any opportunities to learn on the volunteer role, which is a large part of volunteering, in my opinion. So that need to understand why the volunteers coming forward, to give them the right support, to encourage them to develop within the role, develop their own skills, is something that people are looking for. So there were many more questions, and we have a huge amount of data from individuals to consider. So I'm now just going to move on to a very quick resume of the main points we've had of the survey from organizations, which, as I mentioned, is still open. So we had 29 responses, and this low rate means that the figures are of more limited relevance, but they do still provide some useful data. And it may well have been in part due to the nature of the questions that we were asking. The respondents needed to have a good overview of different aspects of their organization, so it may not have been clear as to who should complete the survey. But we're grateful to those people that did, and of them, 65% were from registered charities, and 21% from voluntary or community groups, a small number from social enterprise, and then there's the limited companies. So the scale of the organizations, so we asked about their annual turnover in the last financial, and this slide shows that almost 60% of the organizations had a turnover of less than 100,000, with the remaining 40% between 100,000 and 1 million. So this may be roughly in line with the Charity Commission statistics that suggest that Norfolk has many more small charities, particularly those with income under 10,000, with approximately 55% compared with a national average of 45% being in that smaller category. It may also, as I say, been because of the way that we asked the questions that weren't the right people in the large organizations to respond. And how many volunteer vacancies do you have? So 64% said they needed between 6 and 0 and 9 people, so up to 10 people, up to 10 volunteers, which isn't a huge amount, but obviously in a small organization, if you're down by up to 10 volunteers, it's going to have a big impact on what you can do. 21% said 10 to 29 volunteers needed to fill vacancies, and then up to 100 volunteers were needed to less extent, but still significant, given that without their involvement, services are going to be reduced. And when asked if retention of volunteers over the last 20 months has been a challenge, you can see that 75% said yes. We then asked about how organizations have adapted to make themselves more attractive and to draw in more volunteers. So the first question there is, have you adapted any volunteer roles to be more flexible, for example, remote working or variable hours? And the blue top line are those who are already doing something. The orangey box are those who are planning to make changes. The green box below that are organizations with no plans to make changes. And where they appear, the reddy brown boxes are those where respondents didn't know what the situation was. So people are obviously, organizations are adapting wherever they can. Some perhaps are finding it not possible to do so. If you run something like a charity shop, you probably can't change the hours, or you certainly can't have remote working for many roles. So this one was, the second one was, have you introduced new remote or virtual working opportunities? And 53%, 54% said yes, they had, but 38% said not. Have you provided general training for your volunteers, was the next question. And 81% nearly said yes, they have, which is obviously encouraging. And only a small number really haven't or don't have any plans to. Do you provide supervision and feedback to volunteers? 68% said they do. And another nearly 18% were planning to, but 11% said they didn't, they weren't give supervision or feedback, which seems slightly surprising. We've asked about buddying or mentoring schemes to support new volunteers and or new trustees. 37% of organizations said yes, they had, and 40% said no, they had no plans to. So an area that seems is ripe for a bit more development. Have you created more opportunities for social interactions for remote volunteers was the next question. And 27% have, but 58% have not made those adaptations. So perhaps again, lessons that need to be taken on board because it's something that people do seem to value. Do you record the volunteer hours donated to your organization? 46% said they do. And when asked if they evaluated and reported on your volunteers' contribution as part of a social impact report process, just 15% they did. And actually 50% said no, and they had no plans to do so. Okay, the final of the slides is were asked about whether they have engaged with local employer-supported volunteering schemes, and very few have, just 11% have engaged with that. 61% have no intention of doing so or no plan to do so. And when asked if they'd set up their own employer-supported volunteering scheme, just 7% of organizations said they had, and 85% said they had no plans to. This might well reflect the fact that many organizations are smaller and they probably don't have resources or enough staff to be able to undertake such a scheme. We then asked whether organizations have promoted the volunteer passport training program to their volunteers, and only 7% had done so, and 63% said they had no plans to do so, which is something that we as an organization need to look into and see why that is and if we can promote it more widely. We then are just asked, is it your ambition to have a more diverse leadership team, workforce and volunteer base? And as you can see, 86% said yes, they did definitely want that. When asked how diverse is the leadership team at the moment, this orange section on the right is fairly diverse, and the blue at the top is very diverse. So 50% felt were quite diverse. The other 50% are not very diverse or not at all diverse. So that perhaps is slightly worrying that we need as a sector to be broadening out and looking at how we increase the leadership, broaden the leadership teams. And when asked, have you taken any steps to increase diversity, improve accessibility, 42.8% had done some awareness training for staff and had adapted some of their volunteer roles, which was very encouraging. But 23% only had provided training for trustees or management volunteers, or for 23% for other, and only 19% had involved lived experience advisors. We then, just very briefly now, we wanted to know who it was who was answering these surveys on behalf of organizations. So this is what role in the group organization do you have? 35% were trustees or management committee members, 35% were managers and senior staff members, and 25% were other voluntary roles such as honorary treasurer or organizer of a small group. And then about their demographics. So what gender do you identify as? We have largely female, 68% female, 26% I think that is male. And this ethnicity, 100% English, Welsh, Scottish, Northern Ireland, Irish, or British. And do you have a limiting long-term illness? This is your difference. And 75% people said they had not. Just 25% have. And when we asked about the ages, this it's not dissimilar to the profile of the individual volunteer respondents we looked at earlier, but as expected when aimed at senior staff or leaders, it is somewhat older. 36% were under 50 years old, 36% were between 50 and 64, and 28% were over 65. This compared to 22% of respondents. So this is largely entirely white, older people working or volunteering within the sector. And although it's great that we've got 70% here is 25 to 34-year-olds, it is nevertheless it's quite slightly older age heavy. That's the end of my my presentation on the information. I hope I haven't completely overwhelmed you with too much information. We're now going to take a 5-minute comfort break. So please stay logged in, mute, and keep your cameras turned off. And we'll start again at 2:15 with Jurgen's presentation and his experience. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Nikki. I will have to change, and listen, I offered that short bio to Nikki. I need to change it. Makes me sound even older than I feel. Can't have that. 3 decades, blimey. Well, I'm really delighted to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me. All of you others, do switch your cameras on. I don't mind seeing you. It's great. I shared earlier a story of when I was presenting to a group of blind people, and you couldn't see reactions. It's always much more difficult online as it is. So I've got about 15 minutes. First of all, congratulations to Nikki and her team. An awful lot of effort has gone into this survey, and clearly an awful lot of returns. So well done you. I must stress that the IVR wasn't involved in that survey, and I've been brought in here today to maybe in a sense bring in a slightly different perspective, talk about the sort of trends more broadly, or just be a bit of a disruptor, as I often am. For those of you, and there's quite a few of you whose name I recognize, you might be aware of that already. So Nikki, sort of in a sense, when she invited me, spoke about asked me about talking about the landscape, or the changing landscape, and it was in fact the opening statement of Nikki saying that the landscape is changing, and I think that is absolutely correct. Now, but I think we need to ask ourselves briefly why that is again, and put this little herd of elephants in the room here, because there's a number of things that are currently influencing our changing landscape in the voluntary and community sector, but also more broadly, including the work where the colleagues here who are in the NHS and others will be affected by that. And so we have seen 10 years of clear disengagement of Whitehall with voluntary and community sector activities, that has left a very clear effect on the ground with local infrastructure and other things. That's different in other nations of the United Kingdom. So it's very clearly different, for example, in Scotland. And it's just worth recognizing, because it will also continue to be affected, that sort of trend will be affected by the now new story of further cuts, and how levelling up or those sorts of fundings feed into that, I guess at best at the moment is unclear. There was a short premiership where levelling up had almost disappeared. Now it's back. We don't quite know, but this will clearly affect the landscape in which we operate. The next one, and Nikki, you said, people are coming out of COVID. Frankly, I think we are still seeing the effects of COVID. And while I'm, for one, really glad that I can move about freer and that things are changing, I feel the effects personally. I see it with colleagues, and there was only a few weeks back, people were dropping like flies with COVID, and the potential long-term effects of that, I think, are still not clear. And also, we have worked very differently for 2 years, and I think many colleagues are still feeling quite exhausted and overwhelmed, and sort of this is sort of a change that we need to work through. So this is definitely something that we need to bear in mind, but we need to bear it in mind now also in the context of a cost of living crisis. This will affect our sector, our work in ways that we currently probably can't even quite see. We know of food banks. We're now hearing of heat banks. I saw on the news this morning of heating being prescribed. The colleagues who are here who deal with social prescribing, some stuff will resonate. So those are trends that will affect the work locally, not just nationally. So in that area where landscape is in fact shifting, it is obviously very difficult for anybody to describe the landscape if it's constantly changing. So what I do in those circumstances, in order to look a little bit behind the numbers that Nikki just presented, I look for the landmarks that we have in that landscape. And they are, for example, what Nikki described as the sector. So I will briefly speak about that. But as also what we broadly describe as volunteering and volunteer involvement. I will briefly look at that. But let me start with simply the geographical difference. Behind the numbers that Nikki mentioned, I've just looked at the numbers from the ONS over the last few days on social deprivation in Norfolk. And the ONS is now really quite kind. You can easily put that by constituencies and so forth. You can learn an awful lot very quickly, and there are really marked differences. Great Yarmouth is very different from other parts of Norfolk, and that needs a recognition, and also even within the constituencies. So I didn't put it on slides. I didn't wanted to add any more information, but when we look at the ONS data, we can see that in some constituencies we have a good number of wards or places where they are in the higher part of so being reasonably well off and not that deprived, and none in the lowest percentile. But then you have another constituency where you have hardly any in the more affluent percentiles, and up to about 18 or 19 local neighborhoods that are amongst the 20% most deprived in the country. And this is in Norfolk alone. And so when you then go down into the detail, you will see that work in different places will clearly need to be done differently. And the way volunteering happens, the way volunteer involvement happens, the way engagement, involvement happens, all will be dependent on geographies of that nature. And they are obviously there's marked differences in socio-demographic profiles there that go beyond these sort of summary big numbers of the survey. Those can be explored, and those can be explored when we put together bigger data sets. And so I've spoke of the ONS, but at least for the region, we have the Community Life Survey, which, while it really has its issues, it can bring some of that finer grain analysis to that, so that we see how people in different areas at least responded, and how the responses of this survey would, for example, compare to the East Anglia, or I think it's East England, East of England, and maybe to London, and just see how those responses compare, and then we can sort of get a bit more finer grain. So that was the geographic differences. The theme of the next bit that I'm saying is all about difference. So now let's looking at a sector. Now, I'm being my usual awkward self. I actually don't think there is such a thing as a sector. Doesn't exist. Was cobbled up in the 60s and 70s. Wolfenden Commission and a few others came up with that idea, brilliant idea, but doesn't really work. In Norfolk alone, they've taken that from the Charity Commission. There's about 3,000 organizations. 25 of them have more than half of all the income. And then there's an awful lot who don't have any or very, very little income. And they're doing really rather very different things. And they operate different, they operate for different purposes. And that's only the ones who are registering with the Charity Commission. That's not even going anywhere near where they don't bother to register. And then there's all issues about where exactly have they registered, and those sort of the data isn't that great. But again, Charity Commission is by chance. I know some people who work there. They've made a really nice. You can now access that data pretty straightforwardly, get it at least down to. I think it's constituencies as well, when I last looked. So there's some good stuff there, but we really need to disaggregate that. And the people who are here today, you know, there's definitely colleagues whose names I recognize from work that might be ongoing about social prescribing or those sorts of things, you know, coming very much out of a health and social care side. And there's, I'm sure, colleagues here when I saw earlier, people who come from the district council. I saw, you know, that's a different kettle of fish. So we have very different parts to this, different ways of operating. I was presenting yesterday at a mini conference workshop where groups, it was basically two groups. One was volunteer managers, and one was service user involving, or people who basically organizing service user involvement. And it was striking to see the similarities, but it was also striking to see the perceived differences, and certainly the way the organizations in which these professions sit work really rather very differently. So with that, we need to recognize that behind the numbers that Nikki presented, there's a great deal of difference within the organizations that are responding to surveys like this. Now, I'm very conscious of my timing, and I think I'm supposed to be finishing in 5 minutes. So the next difference will be shorter, I promise, but it's important. And it was striking because it resonated with something that I found in previous research that I did, in fact, with Hastings. The difference between what the little poll that we've just did here together and what it said on the survey, I would suggest was quite more marked than so we had 30% versus 8% on at least one of the results. Quite marked. And what it strikes me is there is a real difference between what volunteer involving organizations think, what might help, where to go, how to do stuff, and what volunteers think, where they want to go and whatever else. And that can be brought together fantastically, and that's been done over decades, and that's what the real skill of sort of volunteer involvement where it lies, to create that synergy, to bring people together with the same vision and achieving stuff. But that is not guaranteed, and I think very often, and especially in a fast changing landscape, those sort of conversations, those discourses might actually run parallel and might not match up as well as people think. So we have differences between the volunteer involving organizations or the sector. So that's one. We have differences between the volunteers, as if I was suggesting that, looking at data from the community life survey. And I think it will be helpful to take that survey and, at least as far as possible, compare them to the replies to the responses from the community life survey. Also, to go one step further, the time well spent survey that NCVO did, they said they would repeat it. I think it will be good to have a look and again try and use some of their data. It's a lot about motivations and changing expectations. And we have the difference. The volunteer involving organizations, a lot different. The volunteers, a lot different. The views between those organizations and the volunteers, a lot different. And the geography in Norfolk as well, different. I think I've caused enough of a stir in terms of there are many different stories hiding behind those numbers. I'd like to encourage you when it comes to looking forward to developing the strategies, the way to think of the involvement, not just of the people who are sort of relatively easy to reach, and the ones who know about service user involvement or patient and public involvement or whatever else, sometimes payments are involved or that sort of thing. But what's far more important is to make those conversations possible. So where do the conversations take place? How do they take place? So one of the things that, just to wrap up really on that's it, because it's been said many times over that the advent of the online conversations, and here we're all talking online, might be of real help in getting things done around training as well. Then certainly from volunteers, not in Norfolk, but in other places, I've heard we don't want to be trained online. That's what we like. We want to be meeting. It's about sociability. Volunteering has an awful lot of aspects to it that are difficult to meet online. But the reason why I'm saying it is, can't remember now where I got the number from, but I can find it if you want to, is there is a significant number of people who just simply don't want to or cannot engage this way. So how, for example, do we plan to continue to be involved with them? And if that is a large number, where are they? In what geographic difference? How do we find each other? Those would be questions that I then put under this sort of, it's often raised, of equality, diversity, and inclusion. If that is a serious component in here, it's not just what background our chief executives have, but how we do our involvement work that makes a difference there. So those would be my sort of disruptive, not they're meant to be sort of trying to put a little bit of fine grain behind those numbers. And 1434, I shut up now. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Jurgen. That was fantastic, and to keep within the time as well was very impressive. You're absolutely right. Of course, there is the more work I do on this, the more I realise that there is infinite amount of drilling down into figures and cross-tabulating to try and understand those variations. It's so easy to lump things together because they sort of go under a heading. And I think you're very wise to warn us off making big sweeping statements because the reality is incredibly varied. So thank you for that. I'm aware that there's been a lot of talking at you, so we've now got a chance to go into smaller groups and to share thoughts. So Lucy Hogg and Amelia Worley and myself will be in each of the 3 breakout rooms that we're going into, and I'm going to ask you to really focus on 2 sorts of questions. One is, how much do the results, these will be written up so you can see them, but how much do the results of the volunteer survey surprise you or fit with your experience, and are there other trends that we need to investigate? And the second element is, what specific support, training or peer learning would help your organisation to thrive? And I was particularly thinking about some of those new elements that we were asking in the survey about, like mentoring and buddying, about impact reports, about employer supported volunteering, about making work more remote. Is there support that your organisation might need to introduce adaptations that perhaps can respond to this variety of need, variety of want that exists within the volunteers that are there working with us at the moment, but might potentially get involved if things are shaped differently. So Laura is in control of the breakout room.
Thank you.
Great. I think, are we all back, Laura? Yeah, we lost a few people along the way.
A couple of people dropped out. One's hoping to return, I think, but yeah, I think we've got everybody that should be here.
All right. Well, I'm sorry that was a short opportunity for conversation, but I thought it was very interesting. Lucy, do you like to feedback a little bit and sort of any key comments that came through?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll do my best. My colleagues from the group, please do chip in if I miss anything. I think the first reflection that we had was that we were surprised that COVID wasn't still more of an issue. I think sort of the feeling out in community, especially within health and social care kind of context, is that it's still very much an issue. And I think, as Jurgen perhaps said, I think that, there was quite a sort of a peak recently around COVID infections. So that was surprising. And I think also the fact that issues around anxiety and mental health were so low, because again, that's something that feels that it's very prevalent still within the volunteering community. The fact that training and involvement is key, that absolutely resonated and chimes with the experience of volunteer involving managers. So that was great. There was a general disappointment that some of the larger organisations hadn't completed the VCSE survey. So one which we kind of share. So we do need to do more to try to get a better response there. And then we went on to have a very interesting conversation actually about the age profile of volunteers and what was driving that, because I think something that surprised us in the results was that it was a younger sort of volunteer pool who responded, and just whether that really chimed with our experience. And Jurgen made a helpful distinction around, and I think Martin and others, around the fact that we did see that kind of upswell of volunteers during the pandemic, people who were on furlough, moving into volunteer roles, and that this might actually, there might be a shift happening with younger working age people being more engaged in volunteering. It doesn't necessarily imply that the older volunteer profile is getting smaller. It might just be that that younger demographic is increasing. So I think there is something quite exciting in the survey response that we can draw from that and explore a little bit more. Anybody else? Did you want to add anything that I perhaps have missed? Have I done? I think I'll leave it there because we don't have a huge amount of time. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. Amelia, have you got anything to feedback?
Yes, so there was, I'm sorry. Just checking that I'm off mute, yes. So we had a really interesting conversation between two organisations that were quite different and contrasting, so Home Start and the Big C. We also picked up that we were surprised that the statistics around the data around COVID was quite low. Big C said they felt that quite a lot of their they lost quite a lot of volunteers during COVID because of sort of health anxieties, but they think that might be down to the fact that a lot of their volunteers have lived experience, so might be clinically more vulnerable. Home Start actually had the opposite experience, and I think I've heard Liz, I sort of feel like I know Home Start story because Liz has come to quite a lot of our events going back to 2020, and I know that right from the outset Home Start volunteers were keen to keep going in their roles, and so they had to adapt roles. So instead of going to families, volunteers going to see families in their own home, they'd meet outside a park instead. I mean, we did take into account the fact that Big C volunteers were mainly in retail, so that meant being in enclosed spaces. So whereas the Home Start sort of volunteers had the option of being outside. In terms of specific support and training, Liz from Home Start made a really interesting point about employer-supported volunteering, and it's something that I hadn't actually considered before, but they said it's really important to Home Start that their volunteers are supported by their workplaces, particularly for the volunteer training period, because to be a Home Start volunteer, you have to do a 5-week training course. And I think Liz said, correct me if I'm wrong, it's about 4 hours a week. So to have volunteers being able to do that train. Oh, sorry, Liz, was that?
Yeah, that's right. It's 1 day a week. So it's 4 hours on a Thursday for 5 weeks, or 1 day, or a Tuesday or what have you. So yeah.
Yeah, and so you were saying, weren't you, that having that sort of flexibility that volunteers can take time out of work was really helpful?
Yes, we have some volunteers who can't volunteer for us because of, once the training period is finished, they can be flexible with their volunteering with the family, but it's accessing the training that is quite specific that we need to think about. Thank you.
So yeah, I think that's something that we're looking at our own organisation's ESB policy, and I think that's something I'll sort of maybe feed back actually, because I don't think we've considered that aspect or that advantage. Also, the Big C said they don't have any formal training at the moment. They're keen to engage with it. And just before we left the breakout room, China was telling us that she's keen to engage with Volunteer Passport, and going to discuss that more. So that's our feedback from that session.
Great, thank you very much. I'll just flag up a couple of things that came up in our group. One was the sort of the benefit of fitting volunteers with roles well and effectively, so that you're using the skills of the volunteers, that they will get a great sense of ownership and agency if they can, if you can fit them to appropriate roles, and also that you can help them sort of feed into the system and use perhaps their contacts, their connections, their links into the community as a way of being able to extend one's own work. And Catherine was giving an example of a volunteer from the LGBTQ community who was working with libraries and enabled them to develop their work in a new and a more engaging way with that community by building on the skills and the experience and the contact of the volunteer. So perhaps it's less of a one-way relationship. It's more about making sure the organisation and the volunteers work together so that there is the best impact, best outcomes for both of them. And we were talking also about that it was pleasing that there was a positive response for training and support, which can sometimes be seen as a difficult thing to sell to volunteers, the idea of training, but also taking on board Jurgen's comments about the benefits of in-person training and experience, and that is something that has the added benefit of the social contact as well, and that perhaps it is something that needs reintroducing more. And actually that was something I picked up from the workforce resilience session we had earlier on in the day, was a sort of the significance of getting people back into the office where they can have that social contact and a sense of community and sense of team working, and that it's convenient to work from home, but there's quite a lot that gets lost in that process. Okay, I think we have just a minute or two left. If anybody has any particular questions or comments that they would like to make at this stage, or if you'd like to just raise your hand, or just, there's only a few of us, just speak up.
Jurgen, is that post that you've just made in the chat, is Gateway to Work, is that the name of a report? I was just on the site and I couldn't see it. Or
You have to scroll down a little bit. It is a name, so unfortunately, not the easiest site to maintain. On that one, if you click on Gateway to Work, it downloads straight away. So you have the report as a download. Others open out in a new window. Don't ask me why that is happening, and I will find some more and share with Nikki and Lucy and Amelia, because that one is about what was going on between the volunteer centres and a government program trying to get people into work, but the issues are similar. But there's at least one more that I'm thinking of, and I will share, but I haven't been able to place my finger.
thank you.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. Thanks for your comments. And anyone else want to make any more points? No. Well, thank you very much. There will be the draft of the strategy going out early next year. Chance for people to come back, feedback, comments. If anything else occurs to you in the meantime, then let us know.